"You're fired right now!" he shouted, not knowing the worker owned the construction company. The morning sun had barely crested over the ridge when James Morgan stood before the gates of Emerald Pines, wearing a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and steel-toe boots that had seen better days. His clean-shaven face bore no trace of the man who sat in corner offices or posed for magazine spreads about real estate moguls. Today, he was Thomas Parker, a laborer looking for work. Emerald Pines was supposed to be Morgan Builders' crown jewel, a luxury housing community promising eco-conscious construction and architectural beauty. Instead, it had become a source of headaches. Complaints were rolling in, foundation cracks in freshly built homes, delays, injuries. Something was rotting beneath the polish. James hadn't always been a CEO. He'd spent 10 years with a trowel in one hand and calluses in the other. It was how he'd built his company, honestly, brick by brick. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. His gut told him this wasn't just a few bad hires. The culture had changed. He needed to see it with his own eyes. The foreman, a guy named Matt, glanced at the forged resume, shrugged, and pointed him toward the site office. "Report to Andrew Clark," he muttered. "He'll find something for you." James nodded and walked across the lot, feeling every vibration of machinery through the ground. Trucks beeped in reverse, power tools screamed, and men shouted over the din. But beneath the noise, James sensed something else. Urgency. Not the productive kind, but the kind born from pressure and disorganization. Inside the office trailer, Andrew Clark sat behind a desk littered with blueprints and energy drinks. Early 30s, buzz cut, designer sunglasses perched on his head like a crown. His handshake was limp, distracted. "Thomas Parker, right?" Andrew barely looked up. "Welcome to chaos. We're short 5 guys today. Just follow the crew pouring foundation on Lot 14. Try not to slow them down." James gave a polite nod and left. He didn't expect a warm welcome, just an honest view of the ground truth. Lot 14 was a swirl of dust and activity. The team was prepping a slab for concrete, but James immediately saw shortcuts, poorly compacted soil, cheap plastic spacers under rebar, no moisture barriers in sight. He quietly picked up a shovel and got to work alongside the others. Hours passed. No one questioned him. He blended in, worked hard, and listened more than he spoke. That night, back in a modest motel outside town, James pulled out a notebook and scribbled notes. No safety meeting held. Workers skipping PPE due to lack of supply. Rebar exposed on multiple units. Clark signed off on incomplete inspections. By the 3rd day, James had built a quiet rapport with some of the guys. He shared lunch with Luis, a veteran mason, and Devin, a young father doing demolition. "You notice how they rush everything here?" Devin said through a mouthful of sandwich. "Andrew just wants it done. Doesn't care if it's done right." Luis nodded, shaking his head. "This isn't how we used to do things. Been with Morgan Builders 10 years. It's different now. No one listens to the old guys anymore." James bit his lip. He had built a company where the Luises of the world were the backbone. When did they become invisible? On day 4, James watched in disbelief as concrete was poured on Lot 15, barely 12 hours after the previous pour, nowhere near the minimum cure time needed. He approached Clark, trying to keep his tone respectful. "Hey, boss, I think that slab's not ready. Still looks green. Could crack if we rush it." Clark turned slowly, as if irritated by the interruption. "Oh, look who decided to give me engineering advice," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Appreciate the concern, Parker, but I don't take orders from guys who push wheelbarrows." James stood his ground. "It's not about orders. It's about quality. If that slab fails, the whole structure's compromised." Clark stepped closer, his voice louder now, drawing attention. "Let me be crystal clear. You're a laborer. I'm the engineer. I say when it's ready." Then, with theatrical flair, Clark turned to the crew. "This guy thinks he's the site manager now. You believe that?" A few workers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Clark turned back, face cold. "You're done here. Grab your tools and go." James didn't speak. He just nodded, walked off site, and climbed into his dusty pickup. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the project that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of his career. He wasn't angry. He was certain. Back in his office that night, James shed the flannel, stood in front of the mirror, and stared at his reflection. The man who had built this company was still there, but now he had seen firsthand how far things had fallen, and Andrew Clark had no idea what was coming next. 3 days after Thomas Parker was fired, the site at Emerald Pines buzzed along as if nothing had happened. Concrete mixers churned, hammers rang out against plywood, and the same urgency pulsed through the air. But something had shifted, something invisible, about to become undeniable. At exactly 9 a.m., a black SUV pulled up to the main construction trailer. Out stepped James Morgan, clean-shaven, suited, unmistakably the man whose name was printed on every sign and blueprint around the site. For the first few moments, no one noticed. Then, whispers started. By the time James reached the steps of the trailer, all work within earshot had slowed to a crawl. Inside, Andrew Clark was mid-conversation with a subcontractor when the door creaked open. "Sorry to interrupt," James said coolly, stepping inside. "I believe we have some unfinished business." Clark's confusion lasted about 2 seconds. Then it hit him. First the flicker of recognition, then the panic just beneath the surface. "Mr. Morgan," he stammered, standing abruptly. I wasn't expecting—" "No, I imagine you weren't," James interrupted, stepping further into the room and setting a thick folder on the table between them. "This is a report from an internal audit I commissioned 2 weeks ago. Includes documentation of code violations, incomplete inspections, and photo evidence of structural shortcuts, several of which occurred under your supervision." Clark swallowed hard. I wasn't aware of any audit." "That's because I was conducting part of it myself," James said flatly. "As Thomas Parker." The silence was instant and suffocating. The subcontractor looked from one man to the other, stunned. Outside, through the thin trailer windows, a crowd of curious workers had begun to gather. James opened the folder and laid out photos. Exposed rebar, unprotected wiring, crumbling temporary scaffolding, and the prematurely poured slab he'd warned about. "I tried to warn you," he said. "You ignored me. Worse, you humiliated me in front of the crew for speaking up." Clark looked like he wanted to defend himself, but no words came. "You're relieved of your duties. Effective immediately," James said, tone final. "Security will escort you off the property. Your final check will reflect penalties for breach of protocol." Outside, as the word spread, workers put down their tools and watched Clark walk off the site, stunned, red-faced and silent. James didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just stood tall in the dust, letting the moment settle, not as punishment, but as a signal. This wasn't about one man. Later that day, James walked the site with Matt, the foreman, and Luis, the veteran mason. They reviewed structural plans, rechecked slabs, and talked openly about the challenges on the ground. For the first time in months, the crew felt like someone was listening, not just watching from above. That evening, James returned to headquarters, still in his boots. He stepped into his office, looked around at the polished wood, the framed awards, the abstract art on the walls. All symbols of success, all suddenly meaningless. He pulled out the drawer of his desk and retrieved a stack of old photos, back when the company was just 10 guys and a pickup truck. They weren't engineers or executives. They were builders, craftsmen. They cared about every nail, every joint. When had that culture disappeared? James spent hours reviewing internal policies, past promotions, project timelines. A pattern emerged. The company had slowly pivoted towards speed, scale, and cost-cutting. The field teams were no longer trusted. They were treated like replaceable parts in a machine. That night, alone under a desk lamp, James picked up a pencil and sketched something new. Not a building, but a program, Masters of Tomorrow. The name came easily. The idea was bold. Train experienced laborers as future site leads and technical mentors. Blend practical wisdom with formal instruction. Create a path from the field to leadership, not through politics, but through merit. It wasn't just a program. It was a reclamation. James sat back, exhausted but clear-headed. The work ahead would be massive. There would be resistance. But the foundation of Morgan Builders needed rebuilding. And this time, it would start from the ground up. And this time, it would last. Within 3 weeks of its conception, Masters of Tomorrow moved from a sketch on James Morgan's desk to the beating heart of Morgan Builders' transformation. It started small, a pilot group of 12 veteran workers, many of whom had spent over a decade on job sites but had never been considered for leadership. Men like Luis, whose hands told stories no spreadsheet could track. Women like Carla Reyes, a crane operator with nerves of steel and the respect of every crew she'd ever worked with. They weren't given titles. They were given opportunity. Classrooms were set up in the old warehouse, lectures in the morning, field mentorship in the afternoons. James personally attended the first few sessions, not as a CEO, but as a peer. He shared mistakes he'd made in his early days, praised the grit it took to stay in the industry, and listened, really listened, to their ideas. And they responded. Safety meetings turned into brainstorming sessions. Site walkthroughs became opportunities to teach, not just police. Within 2 months, injury rates had dropped. Rework costs were slashed. But the most noticeable change wasn't in numbers. It was in attitude. Emerald Pines, once known for its chaos and cut corners, began to buzz with a new energy. The same hands that had once been rushed now worked with pride and precision. Clients started taking notice. Word spread. Something was changing at Morgan Builders. One rainy afternoon, as James reviewed proposals in his office, his assistant knocked gently. "There's someone here asking to speak with you," she said. "Says you might not want to see him." "But he came anyway." James looked up. "Who?" "Andrew Clark." James hesitated. For a moment, his jaw tightened. Then he set down his pen. "Send him in." Andrew walked in with none of his usual swagger. No sunglasses, no polished confidence. Just a man in jeans, damp from the rain, holding a worn leather portfolio. "James," he began, voice steady but soft, "I owe you more than an apology." James gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Andrew took a breath. "I was arrogant. I was wrong. I know what I lost. But I also know why I lost it now." He opened the portfolio and slid a stack of papers across the desk. "This is a training framework I've been working on since I left. It's a fusion of academic engineering and field experience. Real-world problem-solving meets foundational theory. I've seen too many fresh grads who don't know how to read a site, and too many brilliant workers whose knowledge never leaves the field. This could bridge that." James flipped through the pages. Diagrams, schedules, assessment modules, case studies. The work was thorough, and more importantly, grounded in reality. "I didn't come to ask for my old job back," Andrew added. "I came to ask for a second chance, to contribute something better." James leaned back. He studied the man across from him, searching for any trace of the arrogance that once defined him. But it wasn't there. What was there was sincerity, humility, growth. "I won't put you back in engineering oversight," James said. "But if you're serious about this, you can lead the educational wing. Director of Educational Development. You'll report directly to me." Andrew's eyes widened. "You mean that?" James nodded. "We're building something bigger than just buildings now." And so, the program expanded. Masters of Tomorrow was no longer just about field leadership. It became a bridge. Apprentices from trade schools now shadowed senior crew members. Engineers attended field labs led by masons and carpenters. The classroom met the job site. Andrew built the curriculum. Carla hosted the first bilingual training program. Luis became the first instructor promoted to regional mentor. By the end of the year, Morgan Builders had gone from a cautionary tale to a case study in industry journals. Contractors flew in from across the country to tour Emerald Pines, not just to see the homes, but to meet the people who built them. Clients who had once threatened lawsuits now sent referrals. But for James, the victory wasn't in the numbers or headlines. It was in the way workers now walked onto the site, with confidence, pride, and respect. Emerald Pines had become more than a housing development. It was a living symbol of what could happen when people were seen, heard, and empowered. And it was only the beginning. Years passed. Emerald Pines, once a chaotic job site buried under bad decisions and unchecked egos, had transformed into a symbol of integrity. Morgan Builders, now led by a team of former laborers, educators, and engineers who worked side by side, had rewritten the playbook for the industry. Masters of Tomorrow had become a national movement. Other firms adopted its model. Trade schools asked to partner. The industry press called it the Morgan Method. But within the company, everyone knew the truth. The heart of the transformation was forged not in boardrooms, but on dusty lots where work boots met rebar. And yet even the strongest foundations are eventually tested. It happened in early spring. At 2:18 a.m., a massive earthquake, 7.9 on the Richter scale, ripped through the region. It struck without warning. Buildings collapsed, roads split, power grids failed. In seconds, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. News helicopters flew over cities at sunrise, capturing twisted steel and shattered glass. Emergency broadcasts urged residents to evacuate. Shelters overflowed. Panic surged. But in the middle of the chaos, one community stood still, quiet, intact, unshaken. Emerald Pines. Drone footage showed it clearly. Rows of townhouses and apartment buildings untouched. No collapsed walls. No visible cracks. Residents had huddled in closets and under door frames and survived. Within hours, the media descended. Headlines read, "The development that didn't fall, Emerald Pines built to endure," and "What did Morgan Builders do differently?" Interviews with engineers confirmed what James had always believed. Quality didn't just come from codes. It came from caring, from people who refused to take shortcuts, from mentors who taught the why, not just the how, from decisions made years earlier, like the one to halt a slab pour that wasn't ready. 3 days later, James visited the site. Now in his early 60s, his hair grayer and lines deeper, he arrived not as a CEO, but as a man who once wore the name Thomas Parker and swung a hammer in the same dust where others now stood in awe. As he walked through the community, residents came out, some in pajamas, others holding their children. They shook his hand, hugged him. One elderly couple offered him coffee. Another man, a carpenter who had been on the Emerald Pines crew since day one, took his hat off in respect. Then came the family that brought James to a standstill. A woman named Natalie and her husband, Marcus, approached him with their 2 kids. Tears in her eyes, Natalie said, "We live in Unit 15, above the garage slab, the one you stopped." James blinked, surprised. She continued, "I heard the story after the quake. One of the guys told me how a worker once tried to stop a pour that wasn't ready. How he got fired for it. That was you, wasn't it?" James nodded slowly, emotion catching in his throat. Natalie touched his hand. "If you hadn't spoken up, if you hadn't cared, we might not be standing here." The kids hugged him. James could barely hold back the tears, not out of pride, but out of deep, quiet relief. Not every decision had been easy. Not every path had been clear. But this moment made all of it worth it. As the sun dipped low, James wandered alone through the development. He passed playgrounds, balconies, gardens carefully planted by homeowners. Laughter echoed from somewhere nearby, children playing tag on solid ground. He stopped near the foundation slab that had once been a battleground. He knelt down, placed a hand on the cool concrete, and smiled. It hadn't cracked. Neither had he. James Morgan's legacy wasn't built in the steel and cement of Emerald Pines. It was in the trust he'd restored, the lives he'd protected, and the truth he had the courage to face, first as a laborer, then as a leader. And long after the headlines faded and new projects began, that truth would remain unshaken.